So I want you to just take a second and imagine a scenario that honestly might genuinely spike your heart rate.
Oh boy.
Yeah, right? Just imagine that someone, like a complete stranger, maybe a hacker or, I don't know, an investigative journalist, somehow gets unmitigated absolute access to your phone and your laptop.
That is already a complete nightmare.
It is. But here's the catch. They actually do not care about your photos at all.
Yeah.
They are not looking at your browser history, and they have like zero interest in your bank statements or your passwords or any of that.
So what do they want?
They are looking exclusively at your written communication. Every single email you have ever sent, every text message thread you have going back like a full decade,
Oh, wow.
every late night rambling note you've typed into your notes app and then just completely forgotten about. And perhaps most terrifyingly of all, they have access to every single unsent draft.
The unsent drafts. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's the real kicker.
Exactly. Every time you furiously typed out a reply, stared at the blinking cursor, and then just hit backspace until the screen was completely blank. Because you just decided the truth was, well, too honest or too vulnerable or maybe just incredibly harsh to actually put out into the world.
Right. It's a profoundly unsettling thought experiment
It really is.
because we kind of operate under this delusion that the face we present to the world is who we fundamentally are.
Yeah.
We think our identity is this solid, immovable object.
Yeah.
But that paper trail, the sent messages, and crucially, like you said, those ghostly unsent drafts, it tells a story of intense, constant curation.
It really exposes us, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. It reveals the hesitation. It shows the exact millimeter where your courage failed or, where your empathy suddenly overrode your anger. I mean, the unsent draft is arguably the truest reflection of the human condition we have today.
That terrifying, beautiful, incredibly exposing concept of the curated self is exactly what we are exploring today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are taking a really close look at a deeply analytical, extensive review of a novel. It's called The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. But let's just set the mission right at the top here.
Yeah, let's lay it out.
Our goal today is not to give you some basic high school book report. We are definitely not just summarizing a plot.
No, not at all.
We are going to unpack this fascinating review to understand how a story told entirely through letters, which, seems like a pretty old-fashioned format, actually serves as a profound, razor-sharp mirror for our own modern communication.
It really does.
We're going to get into isolation in a digital age, psychological growth, and honestly, the massive chasm between the things we say and the things we actually mean.
And the review we're drawing from makes this brilliant observation right in its opening paragraph, just to set the tone. And I think we really need to carry that tone into this entire discussion.
What did it say?
It suggests that reading The Correspondent is like tuning into an internal podcast.
An internal podcast. I love that phrasing.
Right. It implies that every single letter in this book carries immense, almost suffocating emotional weight. So we really have to approach this analysis with a calm, almost meditative energy today.
So, not a blockbuster action movie then?
Exactly. This isn't an explosive thriller with car chases and cliffhangers. It's a book that thrives entirely in nuance, in the unsaid, and in those quiet, agonizing spaces between the words.
Okay, let's unpack that, because if we are really going to understand why this book hits reviewers so incredibly hard, we first have to wrap our heads around its highly unusual structure.
The structure is everything here.
We are talking about the puzzle of the inbox, because The Correspondent completely abandons traditional linear storytelling. There is literally no omniscient narrator.
Right, none at all.
You don't have that comforting, godlike voice sitting above the story telling you, Eleanor was feeling incredibly jealous, or the room was dark and stormy.
You're completely on your own.
Yeah. Instead, the story is told predominantly, if not entirely, based on the review, through an exchange of correspondence. Letters just going back and forth, no grand, sweeping, cinematic twists early on, just a very, very slow, deliberate build.
Which is so rare these days.
It is. And trying to understand a story this way, it sounds a bit like finding a dusty wooden box of letters at a flea market.
That is a perfect analogy.
You open it up, and it's just a stack of letters from someone named Arthur to someone named Eleanor, and you don't know where they live, you don't know what they look like.
You might not even have Eleanor's replies.
Exactly. You don't have her replies. You are reading only one person's side of a group chat, essentially. And you have to play detective to figure out the actual drama based purely on Arthur's reactions.
And think about what that specific structural choice does to you, the reader. I mean, in a standard novel, You are just a passive consumer.
Right. You're just along for the ride.
Yeah, you're strapped into the author's tour bus, and the author is driving, pointing out the window, saying, hey, look to your left. Observe the protagonist's childhood trauma.
Right, right.
But when a story is told exclusively through correspondence, you are basically kicked off the bus. You are forced to be an active participant.
Because the author is intentionally withholding context.
Exactly. There are massive gaping holes in the timeline between these letters, and this structure creates this immersive, highly voyeuristic quality.
You are literally reading someone else's mail.
You are. You have to infer the devastating argument that happened on Tuesday based entirely on the frosty, overly formal tone of the letter that was sent on Thursday.
Which, honestly, that sounds kind of exhausting. I mean, I have to play detective just to understand the basic plot.
It can definitely feel that way at first.
Because in modern fiction, we are so used to momentum, right? We want the dopamine hit of the next plot twist, the cliffhanger, the big reveal. And the review explicitly notes that this book's pacing leans heavily toward the slow side.
Oh, very slow.
But it argues this is a feature, not a bug. And I have to admit, I really struggled with that idea at first. In a world where I barely have time to read anyway, a slow book where nothing really happens externally, it just sounds like a chore.
It totally feels like a chore if you approach it with a modern expectation of consumption. But the review actually makes a sharp critique of modern media here. It notes that we often prioritize pacing at the complete expense of depth.
Oh, that's so true.
We don't read stories to experience them anymore. We swallow them whole just to find out the ending so we can, tweet about it or talk about it at work.
Yeah, just trying to avoid spoilers.
Right. But The Correspondent is a structural rebellion against that exact mindset. The deliberate, agonizingly slow pace forces you to decelerate your own brain.
You kind of have to, right?
You do. You cannot rush through reading a deeply personal, complex letter without missing the entire emotional undercurrent. The slowness gives you, the reader, the mandatory space to reflect on your own emotional responses.
I see the value in that, I really do. But here is my problem. If you strip away the narrator entirely, and you intentionally slow the pace to an absolute crawl so the reader has to do all this heavy lifting, the writing itself has to be absolutely bulletproof.
Oh, it has to be flawless.
Right. If the prose is even slightly mediocre, I'm putting the book down by page 10. The architecture of the nuance has to be perfect to sustain that kind of active reading, which naturally leads us into how Virginia Evans actually pulls this off with her unique literary voice.
And she really does pull it off.
Our sources note she uses a style of understated elegance. She actively avoids flashy prose, no excessive flowery metaphors, no heavy ornamentation. It is precise, intentional, and deeply introspective.
It's basically the antithesis of purple prose. It doesn't grab you by the collar and scream for your attention.
But wait, let me push back on this format just a bit, because this is where I get incredibly skeptical about epistolary novels.
Okay, go for it.
If the entire book is just people writing letters back and forth, doesn't the dialogue inevitably feel incredibly stiff and unnatural?
How do you mean?
Well, nobody, and I mean nobody, writes a letter the exact same way they speak in real life. When we talk, we stutter, we interrupt, we use slang, but when we write, we edit ourselves.
We do. We curate.
Yeah. We use $10 words. We try to sound smarter than we actually are. Doesn't that inherent curation make the characters feel kind of robotic to the reader?
That is the exact trap most writers fall into when they attempt this format. But what's fascinating here is that Evans anticipates that exact skepticism.
Really? How so?
She doesn't pretend that written correspondence is the same as spontaneous speech. She actually leans into the curation. She knows these characters are editing themselves, but she masters the subtext beneath the edits.
Okay, so she uses the edits as part of the story.
Exactly. The review describes her prose as having a musical rhythm-like soft crescendos, followed by moments of absolute deafening stillness. She captures the hesitation.
So even though you're seeing the polished version...
Yes. Even though you are reading the final polished sent letter, her language is so incredibly precise that you can literally feel those unsent drafts we talked about earlier, lingering right behind the lines.
Wait, how do you actually do that mechanically as a writer? How do you write a polished letter but make the reader feel the backspace key being hit?
It's all done by utilizing negative space.
Negative space, like in a painting.
Exactly like in a painting. It's not about the words on the page. It's about the glaring omissions.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Okay, imagine a character receives a letter that asks 3 very direct questions, all right? Like, How is your mother's health? Did you secure the loan? And are you still in love with me?
Okay, heavy questions.
Right. And then in the next letter, the character spends 3 beautifully crafted paragraphs discussing the loan and discussing the mother's health, but ends the letter without a single word about the third question.
Oh, wow.
Instead of telling the reader, he was too terrified to answer the question about love, Evans just leaves the silence. That omission speaks way louder than a monologue ever could.
That is brutal.
It is. It is the literary equivalent of someone refusing to meet your eyes in a conversation.
Oh, that is absolutely brilliant. And the review actually has this concept that ties perfectly into that. It says emotions in this book exist in shades.
Shades, yes.
It is never just pure, unadulterated anger or blinding happiness. It is confusion mixed with absolute clarity. It is hope violently tinged with doubt.
Because that's how real emotions work.
Exactly. When you write a letter to someone you are intimidated by, you might try to sound incredibly confident, but a little bit of your deeply rooted fear bleeds through in the specific adjectives you choose to use. The source material notes that Evans' language doesn't demand your attention, it earns it over time.
It rewards the reader who is willing to look at that negative space.
Right.
And, that deeply layered, subtle writing style is really the only vehicle that could possibly support the protagonists of this novel.
Because you need a complex character to write complex letters.
Exactly. You cannot have a character study told entirely through negative space and letters without a fiercely compelling, deeply flawed character holding the pen. Which brings us to the core of the book. The mirrors and contradictions of character exploration.
Here is where it gets really interesting to me. The psychology of it. The protagonist of The Correspondent is described in the review as deeply psychologically layered. But they are not larger than life.
No, not at all.
They're not a chosen one with some grand destiny, and they aren't even a particularly heroic figure. They are startlingly, sometimes uncomfortably, real. They mirror our own chaotic, hypocritical, internal monologues.
And crucially, they are not consistently likable.
No. They make frustrating, selfish, contradictory choices.
Which is to say, they are human. I mean, we're all walking contradictions. The review points out that Evans flatly refuses to simplify her protagonist into a neat, easily digestible psychological profile. She allows them to exist in the messy, contradictory middle ground.
So they can be different things at different times.
Exactly. The protagonist can be highly articulate, generous, and emotionally intelligent in one letter, and then completely irrational, petty, and confused in the very next one.
And because we are reading their private correspondence, we start to learn their communication patterns. This is the detail from the review that honestly just blew my mind.
Which part?
You start to notice how the protagonist's tone shifts entirely depending on who they are writing to.
Oh, yes.
It's exactly like code switching, but on paper. The way they write to a demanding family member is completely fundamentally different from the way they write to an old college friend they genuinely connect with. You start to spot the masks they wear.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really redefines the role of the supporting characters.
How so?
Well, in a novel built entirely on correspondence, the person receiving the letter is just as vital as the person writing it. The supporting cast here isn't just a collection of plot devices meant to move the story forward. They function as mirrors.
Mirrors, I like that.
Yeah. Each correspondent reflects a totally different facet of the protagonist's identity. It proves that identity isn't some solid object you just carry around in your pocket. Identity is a collaboration.
Wow, so who you are depends on who you're talking to.
Literally. You do not exist as one fixed person. You are a different protagonist depending on who is opening your letter.
That is a massive paradigm shift for how you read a book. So I don't really know who the protagonist even is until I see how they react to, 5 different people.
Precisely.
The review mentions that each of these relationships exists in its own distinct emotional ecosystem. Some ecosystems are rooted in deep, complex, toxic history.
And some are rooted purely in societal obligation.
Right. Or some are rooted in raw, desperate connection. You can recognize who is writing or being written to just by the atmospheric pressure of the ecosystem they inhabit.
And it's within those distinct ecosystems that the character growth actually occurs. But it doesn't happen the way we are used to in normal fiction.
Right. There's no training montage.
Exactly. Personal growth here is gradual and incredibly uneven. The protagonist doesn't grow because they climbed a mountain or defeated an enemy, The growth happens through the agonizingly slow realization triggered by the sheer act of reading and writing these letters.
Just processing their own thoughts.
Yeah, and the source notes something incredible about this. A single line from a supporting character, just one passing, seemingly innocuous comment in a letter, can completely shatter the protagonist's worldview and cause a massive internal shift.
I love that because that perfectly captures how realization actually works in the real world. It is almost never a lightning bolt of sudden clarity.
No, it rarely is.
It is a slow, creeping dawn, usually prompted by seeing your own toxic behavior reflected back at you through someone else's words.
Exactly.
But if we accept that identity is a collaboration and that we are different people to different correspondents, what happens when those wires inevitably cross?
Well, that's where the trouble starts.
Right. What happens when the version of yourself you are trying to project completely misses the mark of what the other person is actually perceiving? Because all of these complex relationships rely entirely on the written word.
And words are fragile.
Very. Which brings us to the absolute core tension of the novel, and frankly, the terrifying reality that words frequently fail us entirely. Let's talk about the illusion of understanding.
This really is the central beating heart of the correspondent. It's the delicate, fragile, and often incredibly frustrating nature of communication itself.
Yeah.
We desperately want to believe that language is this sturdy bridge that connects our minds to the minds of others. But Evans suggests that the bridge is made of glass, and sometimes it's an outright illusion.
Characters in this novel constantly say things they don't fully mean, right?
Constantly. They actively, intentionally avoid the things they desperately want to express.
Yeah.
And inevitably, they completely misinterpret the messages they receive in return.
This is so universally relatable it almost hurts.
It really does.
Think about the modern experience of agonizing over the punctuation in a text message. It is the exact same dynamic.
Oh, 100%.
It's like when you send a long, vulnerable, heartfelt message to a friend and they reply with just the word fine, followed by a period.
The dreaded period.
Yes. Technically, the dictionary definition of the word fine means everything is okay. It means acceptable. But that period at the end of the word
Changes everything.
that single tiny dot carries 1,000 pounds of unsaid tension. You stare at that period and think, oh God, they are furious with me.
I'd argue it goes even deeper than punctuation, too. This raises an important question. Think about the subtle warfare of an email sign-off.
Oh, absolutely.
If someone who usually signs off with warmly suddenly signs off with best, you will spend the next 3 days dissecting your previous interactions, trying to figure out what you did wrong.
Just from the word best.
Exactly. And this unpacks the massive, sometimes insurmountable gap between perception and reality. A message that feels perfectly clear, perfectly innocent, and perfectly constructed in the mind of the sender can be completely weaponized in the mind of the recipient.
Because they bring their own baggage to it.
Exactly. The context, the current mood, and the deep-seated insecurities of the person reading the letter completely rewrite the meaning of the words.
Which completely obliterates our modern assumption that more communication inherently leads to better understanding.
It really does.
We live in an era where we can text, email, direct message, and voice note someone instantly 24 hours a day. We have more tools for communication than any humans in history. But are we actually understanding each other any better than we did 100 years ago?
The novel forcefully argues that we are not. And it illustrates this failure not through explosive, screaming arguments, but through quiet, tragic conflict.
The lingering misunderstandings.
Yes, exactly. The review highlights how the book builds immense tension through those lingering misunderstandings. Imagine someone reads a letter, misinterprets a slight, and instead of writing back to clarify it, because, that requires vulnerability, they harden their heart and carry that hurt into the next 3 letters they write.
And the other person has no idea why.
Right. The tone shifts, the ecosystem sours, all based on a phantom insult. It proves that communication is as much about listening, in this case reading between the lines, as it is about expressing.
Wow.
If you are reading a letter through the distorted lens of your own insecurity, you aren't actually listening to what the sender's trying to say. You're just reading your own fears reflected back at you.
It's a tragedy of microscopic errors. And when communication breaks down on that fundamental level, when you realize that even your most carefully chosen, agonizingly drafted words are being completely misunderstood by the people you love, the inevitable result is a profound, crushing sense of isolation.
Absolutely.
You are holding a stack of 50 letters from people in your life, yet you are entirely isolated. This brings us to the devastating theme of being alone in a crowded inbox.
The characters in this novel experience intense emotional distance despite being surrounded by voices, despite being in constant correspondence.
It's paradoxical.
It is. The letters are supposed to be a tool to build a bridge, a desperate attempt to close the emotional gap. But often, the sheer, exhausting effort required to translate their complex internal world into written words only ends up highlighting the vast, unbridgeable differences between them.
So what does this actually mean for you, the person listening to this deep dive right now? Because the real-life parallels here are just staggering.
They really are.
Even though the source material is deeply rooted in traditional physical letters, the review points out that it perfectly, flawlessly mirrors the emotional distance we feel right now in the digital age.
We are more connected than any generation before us.
Exactly, quote-unquote connected. Your inbox is overflowing. Your phone is constantly buzzing in your pocket. You are surrounded by a chorus of digital voices. And yet there is this pervasive, documented modern epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah.
The book captures that exact visceral feeling of being completely alone while staring at a screen full of unread messages.
And that ties directly back into the theme of curated identity. When these characters sit down to write their letters, or, you sit down to type an email or an Instagram caption, they are not just neutrally sharing facts about their day.
No, of course not.
They're presenting carefully curated, sometimes highly idealized, and often very defensive versions of themselves. The act of writing becomes a stage performance.
A performance, yes.
You choose the words that make you sound intellectually sharp, or romantically aloof, or completely unaffected by a breakup. It begs a deeply uncomfortable question. Are we ever truly ourselves when we communicate, or are we always, inevitably, performing an identity for the specific recipient?
That is heavy, but it's true because we all do it. You do not send the first raw draft of a difficult email to a colleague.
Oh, never.
You write it out in a rage and then you soften the edges. You curate it. You add a polite greeting. You suppress the raw human emotion to fit the ecosystem.
But the brilliance of the novel, as fiercely noted in the review, is that as the story progresses over months and years of letters, those curated layers begin to inevitably peel back.
Because you can't keep it up forever.
Exactly. The performance simply cannot be sustained forever. The letters slowly, painfully transition from presenting an idealized image to revealing the raw, ugly, unpolished truth. It reflects our own universal struggle with the exhausting maintenance of how we are seen by the world versus who we actually are in the dark when no one is reading.
And the review makes a really poignant, almost beautiful point here. It says that by showing us characters who consistently fail to communicate perfectly, who curate their identities out of fear, and who hide behind their carefully chosen words, the book actually gives the reader permission to recognize their own flaws without judgment.
Yes, permission to be flawed.
You see the protagonist completely mess up a vital relationship because of a stubborn, easily fixable miscommunication, and you don't judge them. You think, oh my God, I have done exactly that.
Right.
It makes it a deeply personal reading experience.
Yeah.
You aren't judging the characters from above. You are empathizing with their desperate, failing attempts to connect.
It creates a sacred space for introspection. It doesn't lecture the reader about how to communicate better. It simply holds up a very clear, very unforgiving mirror.
Which brings us to the final verdict. We have spent all this time talking about the heavy emotional themes, the fascinating psychological structure, the philosophy of miscommunication. But let's look at the reality of actually sitting down with this physical object in your hands.
Let's get practical.
Right. We need to weigh these brilliant, high-minded concepts against the actual execution of the novel, the strengths, the weaknesses, and the ideal audience. Let's be real for a second.
So to synthesize the final evaluation from our source material, the book's undeniable strengths are its incredible, suffocating emotional depth, its highly unique and immersive narrative structure, its wildly authentic take on the curation of dialogue through letters, and its vast thematic richness regarding identity.
That's a lot of praise.
It is, but the review is very clear that it is not without its significant challenges for certain readers.
Okay, what are the drawbacks?
The weaknesses, or rather the elements that might heavily alienate a mainstream audience, include its exceptionally slow pacing, its fragmented narrative style that requires active detective work, the distinct lack of clear external conflicts or action sequences, and an ending that is highly subtle and open-ended.
So no big explosion at the end.
None at all. It is a book that sits very, very firmly in the genre of literary fiction.
So let me play the skeptic for a moment, just for the sake of anyone listening who might be on the fence right now.
Sure.
If someone is prepping for an insanely busy week at work, their brain is completely fried, or they just want to decompress on the weekend with a fast-paced thriller where the detective catches the killer on page 300 and all the loose ends are tied in a neat little bow.
They should probably absolutely skip this.
Right.
I mean, who is actually going to sit down and read this after a 10-hour workday?
If your brain is fried and you need escapism, yes, absolutely skip it. And the review is very intellectually honest about that reality. This book is not trying to be everything to everyone, and it doesn't apologize for that.
I respect that.
If you are looking for quick entertainment, a plot-heavy adventure, or a story with neat, satisfying resolutions to every problem, this format will likely frustrate you to no end. It is actively hostile to the casual reader seeking mindless escapism.
I appreciate that honesty. But if it's hostile to escapism, what is the core value proposition? Why put yourself through the ringer? For those who genuinely enjoy character-driven stories, who love dissecting internal journeys and psychological nuance, the review describes it as nothing short of a masterpiece.
Wow, a masterpiece.
Yeah. It is a book that fundamentally respects the reader's intelligence. It
Yeah.
doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't insult you by over-explaining every emotion. It trusts you to sit comfortably with the ambiguity of human connection.
The review has a great, striking way of phrasing that value proposition, too. It says that when you buy The Correspondent, you aren't just buying a story to consume and forget. You are investing in an experience.
An experience, yeah.
An experience that creates emotional echoes days after you finish reading the final page.
Emotional echoes, that's a great term.
Isn't it? You'll be standing in your kitchen making coffee 3 days later, and suddenly you will think about a specific, devastating line from one of the letters in Chapter 4, and it will suddenly click in a completely new way.
That's the mark of a great book.
It's the kind of book that actively, aggressively invites rereading, because once you know the whole story, once you know how the relationships end up, going back and reading the early formal letters from a different perspective changes their meaning entirely. You see the tragedy baked into the very first hello.
It is a significant investment of your time and your emotional energy. There's no denying that. But it yields a profoundly high return for the right kind of reader willing to do the work.
I absolutely love that concept of emotional echoes. Well, as we bring this deep dive to a close, I really want to thank you for joining us on this exploration.
Looked at a great conversation.
We've unpacked how The Correspondent is so much more than just a clever gimmick of using letters. It is a powerful, lasting testament to the quiet, terrifying complexities of human emotion.
Absolutely.
It highlights the immense danger of the unsaid things sitting in the negative space between us, and it captures the beautiful, messy, and often failing attempt to truly, genuinely know another person in a world entirely separated by distance and curated words.
And, to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over today, drawing on everything we've discussed about curated identities and the agonizing process of communication. If someone were to gather every single email, text message, and letter you've sent over the last calendar year, what kind of carefully curated, heavily edited identity would they see? And perhaps, much more importantly, what crucial, fundamental truths about who you really are did you leave entirely hidden in the unsent drafts?
Wow, that is absolutely a question to keep you awake tonight. Thank you so much for listening. Keep questioning the world around you. Always keep looking for the subtext and the negative space. And we will see you on the next deep dive.